Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol and I'm the president of the American Council on Germany. I'd like to welcome you to our weekly Kaffeepause when we regularly check in with a Berlin-based journalist to talk about the stories shaping the headlines. Today, we're joined by Matthew Karnitschnig. He is Chief European Correspondent for Politico and based in Berlin. Matt, it is great to see you.
Thanks for having me again.
Well, I am delighted to have you back, particularly since, as I was looking through the calendar, we last spoke in the context of the Kaffeepause in December, and an awful lot has changed since then. So I look forward to getting some of your insights on what has transpired in the last 4 months and what some of the outlook is for the future. But before we do that, I want to come back to sort of current events. Having lived in Berlin for a number of years, I always know that May 1st was a day when sometimes there would be burning cars in Kreuzberg and demonstrations and riots. Yesterday seemed a lot more peaceful than on some occasions in the past, but there were some interesting tensions at some of the rallies that sort of shed some light on the political landscape in Germany today. For example, at a rally hosted by the Deutsche Gewerkschaftsbund, or the German Trade Union Confederation at the Brandenburger Tor, the Berlin mayor, Franziska Giffey, was pelted with eggs. In Düsseldorf, where Olaf Scholz spoke, he was called a liar and a warmonger. And this, for me, is just one more sign of the really difficult position that Olaf Scholz is in. Some in his party and in the trade unions are in strong opposition to his plans to strengthen the Bundeswehr and increase military spending. At the same time, others in his party, in the Greens, in the opposition, the Christian Democrats, are critical of his waffling on the export of heavy weapons to Ukraine. So before we talk, though, about sort of defense spending and the complexities of providing arms to Ukraine, one question that was front and center yesterday in Düsseldorf is, will Scholz's commitment to increase defense spending impact some of the campaign promises that he and his party made, such as building affordable housing and providing other social welfare services? I mean, this seems to be kind of one of the undercurrents that's playing out in German politics, but also in the German public.
The short answer is yes. I think that not so much the German Zeitenwende, but the war in Ukraine changes everything and has confronted Scholz and this new coalition with a completely different set of realities from what they thought going in. So I think you can more or less, forget much of what was in that coalition agreement and, start to redefine how this government is going to approach both domestic politics and foreign policy. So, it reminds me a little bit of the years after September 11th in the United States, where, after it happened, people didn't really understand, I think, what the world was going to look like going forward, but they knew that it was going to be dramatically different on all levels. And I think that's what you're seeing play out in Germany right now, both in, as I said, the debate about domestic politics, but also foreign policy, because their entire view of the world has essentially been completely discredited overnight. And this was and I'm referring here to the posture towards Russia, and that requires a massive rethink. I mean, if you just think about energy, for example, and the impact that's going to have, on German households, on companies, nobody really knows how that's going to play out yet.
And yet, it seemed to me that one of the things that Scholz was saying was that he still plans on delivering on some of those campaign promises. I mean, I think you're right that the war in Ukraine changes everything, both in terms of domestic politics and in terms of foreign policy. But he seems to still be trying to hold on to some of the things that he was hoping to introduce that would really be improvements for the German public.
I think that's fair enough. It's a wealthy country. He can afford to do some of both, and they will. But I think the danger for him is that there are a lot of unknowns here.
Right.
And if you take, for example, inflation, which is running at over 7% in Germany at the moment. They've tried to ameliorate that a little bit with some, special aid and so forth for people, but none of this is really sustainable. So I think a lot will depend also on what happens to the economy over the next year or two, and how much fiscal space they have, because we all know how sort of parsimonious the Germans are on paper, at least. And if they really, in addition to this 100 billion that they're supposedly going to be spending on defense, and will some of that be redirected? I mean, that's sort of the great fear of the CDU now, is that they're not committing Scholz's government to using this 100 billion only on the military, in fact. And there are a lot of sort of loopholes one could build into that Sondervermögen, as they're calling it, which is really just a huge hole in the budget of 100 billion. Remember that they also took the 60 billion that had been earmarked for COVID related relief from last year, and intend now to use that to manage the energy transformation and so forth. So at some point, if the economy doesn't really grow enough, they're going to start feeling the pinch here. But Germany, it has to be said, has more leeway on the fiscal front than most countries in Europe.
So Matt, you've alluded to this already. I mean, there are two really big debates unfolding in Berlin right now, and I definitely want to get to both of them. One of them is on defense spending and the supply of military hardware to Ukraine. The other is over energy. And so I'd like to sort of take each of them in turn. Despite the decision last week to supply anti-aircraft tanks to Ukraine, Scholz is really sort of on the defensive at the moment about being cautious, and he is rejecting criticism of sort of the amount of time it has taken him to take action. The move to supply tanks does not seem to have sort of changed public perception, and the public seems to be in favor of supplying weapons. There was a survey that was conducted by Infratest, DMAP, a couple of weeks ago, or I guess about a week and a half ago, about whether Germany should deliver heavy weapons to Ukraine. Among Greens, 72% were supportive. Among Social Democrats, 66% were supportive. Among the FDP, 65% were supportive. And even among the Christian Democrats, 63% were supportive. Why do you think Scholz is having such a hard time communicating sort of his intention to the public and sort of taking steps in doing what he has said he would do?
Well, I think you have a couple of things going on here. One is that there are sort of influential figures in his own party who, are not exactly enthused about sending heavy weaponry or, spending this much money on defense and so forth. So I think that initially he was sort of waffling, trying to keep everybody here on the same page, but I think if you stand back and look at how Germany has handled this crisis from the beginning, there's a clear pattern here, which is, they basically are dragged kicking and screaming into sort of every, step of kind of turning the screws on Russia, whether it was sanctions or, the SWIFT decision, which they never, fully supported to this day because they're still using SWIFT to pay Russia for the gas. And now this thing about, what they call heavy weapons. But, I mean, unfortunately, I think it's a bit of distraction from what is going on in Ukraine, because if you were just to read the German press, and I think a lot of Germans believe this because they're only exposed to German media, you might get the impression that sort of, the future of Ukraine depends on whether or not Germany is going to send some, Soviet era anti-aircraft tanks to Ukraine or not. And that's just not the case. I think that unfortunately what's happened here is that the Germans have lost almost complete sight of what the United States, the UK, other NATO allies are doing in Ukraine, and the degree to which that support has really allowed Ukraine to stand its own in this fight. And the Germans are just so immersed in their kind of internal struggle. And they're convinced that, as a result of this, they're going to be targeted now by Russia. There's a big story today about the Bundestag. They have sort of a research service there that is sort of an objective arbiter of facts on pretty much any question. And they've released an opinion saying that if Germany were to sell these weapons or to give these weapons to Ukraine, that in itself wouldn't make Germany a party to this war. But if they were to train Ukrainian soldiers how to use these tanks, for example, which they're already doing, that would, under international law, make them a party to this war. And, these kinds of discussions are just completely divorced from the fact that this is already going on within NATO. Germany is a member of NATO, and this is going to happen whether Germany supports it or not. And the same thing I would say is this letter, that was this open letter that has gotten a lot of attention over the past few days, written by Alice Schwarzer, the feminist sort of icon in Germany, and who was also convicted of tax evasion, but that's another story. And a number of artists and writers and this type of thing, saying, that Germany shouldn't be sending heavy weapons, and there needs to be, more effort put into diplomacy and all this kind of stuff. This has got huge attention here. So, I think all of that just sort of serves to distract from the realities of what's happening in Ukraine. And I think just one last sentence on that. I think the real point here, coming back to your question, the reason this is happening, and you pointed to the polling data, which tells a completely different story. I think most regular Germans are completely reasonable, and they understand, what's at stake here, what's going on in Ukraine. They're not sort of Russlandversteher or something like that. But the press here is just waiting to jump on all of these open letters or whatever, and they magnify the kind of resonance of these types of things to such a degree that if you're looking from the outside, it thinks like, well, half the country, must agree with Alice Schwarzer, which isn't the case. And a lot of this, if you watch sort of the talk shows and stuff like that, you always have the Linke is always very well represented, in these fora. But if you look at the last election, the Linke got less than 5% of the vote. And only ended up in the parliament. Normally, they wouldn't be in the parliament with less than 5%, but because of somewhat of a technicality, they ended up getting in there. But again, if you were to just consume German media, you would think, that this party is one of the leading forces in German politics, which just isn't the case.
So Matt, in terms of sort of the realities and trying to parse those realities, you recently conducted an interview with Gustav Gressel, and he used to work in the Austrian Defense Ministry, but he's now with the European Council on Foreign Relations in their Berlin office. He's a security expert. And in the piece that you wrote, I thought he had some really interesting insights on Germany's ability, or rather inability, to provide arms to Ukraine. And I thought that that might be something that would be really interesting to have you share with our viewers today, because as you've alluded to, we're not talking about modern state-of-the-art weaponry. We're talking about old Soviet era equipment, and there's a big difference there between the two.
Right, and I mean, this is the kind of equipment that Ukraine has asked for, in part because they know how to use it. So it should really be kind of a no-brainer to send this kind of stuff. Much of it is not owned by the German government anymore, because they, have returned it to the manufacturers, which is a process, I guess, in arms procurement, but they still have the license essentially. So they would have to give their permission for the companies that own this weaponry to allow them to send it to Ukraine. But I think that what Gressel was getting at in the interview was that this will have and already is having a lot of impact on Germany's standing, both within NATO and within the EU. And it's not going to have a positive impact. And he compared it to Silvio Berlusconi's Italy, not in the kind of bunga bunga sense, but in the sense that it was a large country, fairly wealthy country, but really didn't have any real political sway in Europe for a number of years, because nobody took the government seriously. And I don't think Germany is there yet, but if the allies to the east, in particular, do not feel that they can count on Germany, it's going to be very difficult, I think, for Scholz and whoever succeeds him to push German priorities either at the NATO level or in the EU, because there's going to be this tendency, as we're already seeing, to want to draw the US deeper into European security. It already is very deep, obviously, and that's sort of one of the realities, I think, that we've seen again in this crisis, is that when the bullets start flying, there's sort of a rush to the US and calls for the US to really step up in Europe, which we saw obviously in the wars in the Balkans in the 1990s, and we're seeing now again this reflex. So all of these calls, these expectations for more strategic autonomy in Europe and so on. I personally think that is just going to go by the wayside now, not because there aren't people who still want that. And in fact, some people would say, well, this is, shows how much we need this. But I think if you look at the reaction of, the Baltic countries, Poland, even the Czech Republic, to the way, Germany has handled itself here, I think what they're really looking for is more from the U.S. and 100 billion in spending by Germany isn't really going to change that, I fear, because if you just take that number, for example, I mean, that might compensate for the last several years of underspending, or the last decades of underspending on the military, but it's not necessarily going to be a game changer. And I think, as we've seen in these recent debates here in Germany, it's not going to change the mentality. And I think that really is what needs to shift, especially amongst the elites, who, it has to be said, are not all of them by any means, but many. There's still a strong sort of anti-American sentiment in the German political establishment, and the last thing that they want to see is more American influence in Europe.
Matt, I think when we spoke in December about the newly formed government, we recognized that one of the biggest challenges for Olaf Scholz as chancellor was going to be keeping sort of his three the three coalition partners together, and also to make sure that there weren't divisions within his own party, but also within the Green Party in terms of different factions in the Social Democrats and the Greens kind of going their own way. And in many senses, as you pointed out, the war in Ukraine really has been a stress test for this young government that had a steep learning curve to begin with. We're frequently seeing sort of different positions and different statements from government officials, where Scholz on some issues has been far more reluctant, waffling, I think was one of the words that you used. Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister who's a Green, has been talking about coming up with pragmatic and creative solutions to try to find ways to supply the Ukrainians with the weapons that they need. But the other sort of really big issue that is playing out, of course, is the energy debate. And Germany finds itself in a huge energy conundrum. The European Union now is gearing up for the 6th round of sanctions against Russia. And one of the top items on the list is an oil embargo. And in the past 24 hours, we've seen both Annalena Baerbock and Robert Habeck, the economics minister and vice chancellor, speak out in favor of an oil embargo. Even Jörg Kukies, one of Olaf Scholz's closest advisors, has said that Berlin is now in favor of an oil embargo. Are we seeing a sea change in Germany in terms of its position on phasing out Russian oil imports?
I don't know if it's a sea change. I think that the Greens in particular see this as a good way to further, their other main priority, which is the energy transformation. So for them, it's in a way, they wouldn't say this publicly, but it's sort of a blessing in disguise because they want to move away from fossil fuels. They want to promote more electric alternatives and so forth. And this is a perfect, sorry, my phone is ringing here. This is a perfect opportunity for them to help make that happen. So I think you're going to see more reluctance on this front on the part of the SPD as we already have, because they have a different base. Their base is less ecologically minded, and they're also very price sensitive. And price of a gallon of gas here is it's about €8 right now, which is a lot. And I think it might happen. It might still happen, an oil embargo, because oil is something that the Germans can get elsewhere. They're not as dependent on Russian oil as they are on gas. But there's no doubt that would be felt at the pump. I think that for the SPD, it also might be a way, if they pursue this, to say, going down the road, well, we don't need to have a gas embargo because we've already embargoed oil, and this will be kind of compromise. You see the Germans often, trying to go halfway on things, like with SWIFT, for example. So we'll sort of, we'll cut off, all but 2 of the banks, but we need those 2, which kind of completely blunts the purpose of the whole thing. But so that's why I think we could see ultimately some sort of compromise here. There'll be more debate about it and more kind of kicking and screaming. But then ultimately, if you look at Scholz's record over the past couple of months, you have to say, well, he'll probably end up doing it in the end, right. Because he tends to kind of look out the window and see what the public opinion is, and then and then he'll make his decision. And I think that was the reason, quite honestly, that he ultimately decided to go forward with the heavy weapons exports to Ukraine, because he saw that the public was very much behind it, in contrast to a lot of people in his party and a lot of the media.
So I think one of the reasons why Germany had seemed sort of initially opposed to the oil embargo was concerns about how much time it would take Germany to sort of adapt to not having that oil come in, and now it seems as if that timeline has shortened. Are there any thoughts on sort of what sort of an impact this would have on Germany and on Germany's sort of energy consumption? I'm asking because I did see over the weekend that Spiegel put out a report with some pretty dramatic numbers that Germany has already reduced its import of Russian oil from about 35% to 12%. It's reduced its import of Russian gas from 55% to around 35%. And it's reduced its import of Russian coal from 50% to 8%. So those are already some pretty impressive numbers. On Deutschlandradio today, I heard people should plan on wearing sweaters and turning the heat down in their apartment. They should plan on riding their bicycles and not buying gas. They should plan on just much more expensive energy costs. How is sort of the German public taking the rise in prices, and what sort of a timeline do you think the German government is looking at in terms of helping sort of facilitate this energy transition? Because obviously the renewables are not going to be in place anytime soon that Germany would need to fill the void.
Yeah, I mean, the hope, I think, of the Greens is just this, that people will consume less, especially less gasoline by driving less. But as you say, I mean, this is a transition that's going to take decades. They're already running into capacity problems with electric cars, for example. There aren't enough parts, and COVID has complicated all of the supply chains and all the rest of it. So there's huge waiting lists for electric cars and that type of thing. Also because they're heavily subsidized, so people have a real incentive now to buy the cars. So there's a lot of foreboding, and I think people are starting to save more. There was sort of consumer price data that came out today that showed a lot of goods are up by 8%. Spending on a lot of consumer goods has fallen by 8% as a result of the rise in prices, which, as I said before, are now over 7%. So you're seeing it affect consumption already, and that clearly doesn't bode well for Germany's retail sector. So people are worried, and you hear people talking about it a lot, at in the Gasthaus or the cafe or whatever, but I think there's a recognition that this is something that the government is certainly not responsible for, and is not really well equipped to resolve on its own, given that the causes lie elsewhere. So I'm not sure that this is really going to become a political problem for Scholz, for as long as he can sort of blame this on the war and the kind of the global picture.
So I really want to take advantage of the opportunity of having you with us today, because we have not spoken sort of in a forum like this since Olaf Scholz made his big Zeitenwende speech at the end of February, or sort of seen how that has played out. And obviously, it was a big speech on many levels. It really was a tectonic shift in German policy, both in terms of foreign and defense policy, but also in terms of energy policy, and laid out some lofty goals and some guidelines for the future of German foreign and security policy. And here we are, 2 months later, and we're seeing obviously that the devil is in the details in terms of implementing some of the goals that were outlined in the Zeitenwende speech. But I'm curious, to hear from you as a longtime observer of German politics, how you would put Scholz's speech in context with sort of social democratic foreign policy and Germany's policy toward Russia, but then also ask you whether you think that this pivot that was announced at the end of February is here to stay, even if we're seeing some initial growing pains in its implementation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's still too early to say, to be honest. I mean, my sense is that the Zeitenwende speech was something of a panic reaction, you know, and we're seeing the results. I wrote at the time, that this isn't, this isn't going to change the past 15 years of misguided policy and the results of that, because a lot of us believe that German policy wasn't just naive, but it led to or contributed to this war, by signaling to Putin that there weren't going to be any consequences for going into Ukraine, just as there weren't any consequences after Crimea or after the wars in eastern Ukraine. And I think it's very important to remember that the green light for Nord Stream 1 came in 2015 after the wars in eastern Ukraine had started, after the downing of MH17 and so forth. So he was clearly not expecting Germany to react in this way, and he had sort of good reason not to expect it. So is it sustainable? I mean, we're seeing that kind of play out in the political debate now, and I'm not sure it is sustainable. 100 billion all of a sudden, it's not clear, how much is going to be actually spent on defense. I think that there's all of this finger pointing going on now over who was really responsible for the appeasement of Russia, and was it just the SPD, or how much did the CDU, and then everybody is sort of either blaming Merkel or Gerhard Schröder and all these people. But I think the reality is that the entire political establishment is to blame, and also the corporate establishment, because they were the ones who were really pushing this behind the scenes and influencing the politics. And we ran a story recently about the Ostausschuss, which is this special committee that was set up in the 1950s to promote German industry with Eastern Europe, and in particular with the Soviet Union and then Russia. And they continued to do that after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And these are the forces really here that kind of led Germany to this place. And I don't think that one speech is going to convincingly sort of change that, especially because a lot of people still think that, well, sooner or later we're going to have to, be dealing with Russia again. It's too big and too important, and some of this reflex that as a German, you shouldn't anger them too much, sort of thing. So I think the jury is very much out on this. Also because I think that the SPD in particular, their view of the relationship with the United States is somewhat ambivalent, and it's not clear to me, how that is going to be affected by a potentially different president in the White House. And if you imagine that in a couple of years, if there's another Republican, even if it's not Donald Trump or it's somebody else, I think you have to expect that they would take a let's say less magnanimous view towards Germany and its recent policies than Joe Biden and his administration has. So I think there's still a lot that has to play out here before we'll know.
So, Matt, obviously the war and the Zeitenwende speech have caused Germany to rethink its policy toward Russia, to rethink its dependence on Russian energy sources. To what degree are people thinking even more broadly of that? Is there a renewed debate or discussion about Germany's dependence on China or the interdependence with China. Do you see that unfolding as well, or is everything focused on the East right now and the war in Ukraine?
I would, it's only been, 8 weeks, give or take. So I think everything still is focused on the war and Russia and how to reduce the dependencies there. It would be too overwhelming, I think, for most Germans to reflect on how dependent the country has become on China as well. And they're not going to be able to withdraw from China without doing massive damage to the economy. I mean, Germany is much more dependent on China economically than Russia. Russia is a source of energy, obviously, but as a kind of driver of the German economy, it's not really that important. But China is, and this is a question that is sort of lurking in the background. This past week, Schwarz went to Japan and made a big deal about how he was going to Japan because it's a democracy, and this is sort of meant to be a signal towards China that they aren't happy with the human rights record of China and all this. But this is sort of what they've always done. They pay lip service to the human rights issue in China and continue to do business with them, just as the United States does, to be honest. So, I don't think that the question of Germany's engagement with China is something that Schwarz is eager to tackle at this moment. And I think that the focus will remain on trying to wean Germany off of Russian gas to the degree it can, and that itself will be extremely difficult, especially in the coming year.
So in terms of sort of talking about the rest of the world, it's also interesting to note that Narendra Modi is in Berlin today for, I guess, the sixth round of bilateral talks between Germany and India. India, of course, has not really taken a position on the war in Ukraine. To what degree do you think that the war in Ukraine will be part of the talks between Modi and Scholz today, as well as other cabinet members?
Well, I think the Germans are probably quite sympathetic with India on this because for a long time they kind of had similar positions towards Russia. So I don't think that that Scholz will put the screws on him to endorse sanctions or something like that. Not that he can. I don't think that India is not a major focus for Germany, to be honest. And I don't think that will change. It's obviously a very important country, but Germany sort of put all of its eggs, I think, when it comes to Asia in the China basket. And I think that's where it's going to remain, and it's willing. China obviously has a different policy towards Russia and Ukraine as well, and Germany is quite willing to look the other way on these issues. So I don't think that Ukraine will loom very large in their discussions, to be honest.
So, Matt, as we come to a close, I'd like to ask you about another story that was creating a bit of buzz over the weekend, namely Friedrich Merz, the head of this Christian Democratic opposition, announced that he wanted to visit Kyiv today. And a number of people saw this as a important step, that the more high-level politicians from Western Europe that visit Kyiv, the better. But others were really asking, what's the point of the head of the opposition party in Germany visiting Ukraine? What does this do for Zelensky, if anything at all? And particularly given that Friedrich Merz's home state of North Rhine-Westphalia is facing an election in a couple of weeks. Some people even said, is this more of a campaign stunt for the state election, or is this a way in which Merz is trying to really differentiate himself from Scholz and show leadership? What's sort of your take on the buzz around Merz's proposed trip to Kyiv?
Well, I think that he's taking advantage of the fact that Schulz didn't go, and then Schulz kind of created an opening here, quite frankly, by sort of demonstrably not going. And as you said, everyone else in the Western world seems to have shown up there since Boris Johnson went. He was the first, of course, in his suit and tie, walking through Kiev, and that kind of broke the dam and convinced a lot of people that it was safe to go. I'm not clear on why Schulz hasn't been there yet, quite honestly, but now it's too late. I think merits politically, it's not a bad move. I don't know that it will help with the local election there in North Rhine-Westphalia, but it can't hurt. And he's even going without police protection because he decided to go, I guess, just on Friday, and they didn't have enough time to arrange it. So it makes him look all the more sort of courageous for going there. But I think it's purely political, to be honest, and a miscalculation, I think, by the Schulz camp, to not get him out there sooner. He gave, I thought, a very impassioned speech yesterday in Düsseldorf that you referenced earlier. Is the first time that you really saw that he had some sort of fire in him, and shouting down the hecklers and making the case for sending weapons to Ukraine. And I think that will probably play well. But with Schulz, he's giving a big interview tonight on ZTF where he's going to sort of take questions. But I think he needs to kind of show a little bit more emotion, like he did in Dusseldorf, which is not really what he's known for, obviously. But I think in a situation like this, where people are looking for orientation and sort of trying to understand, what Germany is doing and why, he really needs to be out there more, whether it's in Kiev or in Berlin.
Do you think that there's any chance that Scholz might go to Kyiv together with Macron? I mean, there's been some discussion about Macron, now that he's been reelected, needing to set the agenda for his second term in office. He is likely to go at some point, and it could be a strong signal to have the head of Germany and the head of France go together.
That certainly would be a strong signal. I don't know if I would recommend, for security reasons, that the leaders of the two most important countries in Europe go to a war zone together. But that certainly would be not just a strong signal, but would also, he could sort of one up Merz here, because he doesn't want to look like he's now that Merz is gone, he doesn't want to look that he's just kind of going to copy Merz. So. It would have to be something like that, I think, for him to go, probably. Although, as I said, the Russians, were quite clear that they're not very happy about these visits. And after Tony Blinken and Austin, went last week or the week before, they bombed those train stations along the train line that they took. So, I think that should give people a bit of pause about how wise it is to undertake these trips.
Well, Matt, unfortunately, our time is up, but it is always great to talk with you. And I want to thank you again for making the time to join us for this virtual Kaffeepause. I always enjoy hearing your insights and exchanging views with you. And so I hope we'll be able to have a chance to do that in person, but also virtually in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Steve. It was great.